Just as the guard loosened his grip, Marcus Kane sank slightly to his knees as if about to collapse. But only a split second later, he twisted, pulling from his sleeve the toothbrush he had sharpened over many nights. In a single breath, he lunged forward toward the back of female guard Elena Ward, arm raised high, and the entire row of inmates held their breath, waiting to see how that terrifying moment would end. Before we continue, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts about this story. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit like and share so more people can see it. Most importantly, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We post fresh content every day at the same time. A dramatic story. Shown. The steel door closed with a heavy bang, like a boulder dropping to the bottom of a well. The echo rolled across the cold walls, crawled into the cracks, then faded, leaving behind a silence so dense one could hear the beat of one's own heart. The solitary cell was small and square, like a wooden box forgotten in a basement. Low ceiling, walls mottled with damp patches, a dry concrete floor that sucked out all warmth. A jaundiced bulb dangled bare from above, its crooked light falling at an angle, casting silver slashes as thin as knives, cutting across the darkness. Marcus Kane sat down on the rickety iron bed. The springs beneath the thin mattress groaned faintly, like the feeble protest of something long exhausted. His forehead was still beaded with sweat. His back still felt the cold concrete of the cafeteria floor, the fall before hundreds of eyes, a burning memory lodged deep like a shard of glass. The crash of the metal tray, the sharp intake of the inmates, the unblinking stare of Elena Ward, all piled up into a violent halo behind his eyelids. The moment he shut them, they rushed out mercilessly. Humiliation. The words slid down his throat, thick and clotted. Years ago, he was accustomed to seeing others bow before his half-smile, accustomed to the white lights above the meeting room ceiling, where a single word from him could sketch out someone's fate. Now, the only light was the wavering bulb, trembling as the draft crept in through the crack in the door. His former power had thinned into vapor, clinging to the walls like a fragile layer of mold. Touch it, and it vanished. Somewhere, a drip fell, likely from an old pipe, measuring time instead of a clock. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop striking the floor felt like a needle stabbing his thoughts. He looked around. A cold toilet, a square vent coated in dust, a tiny steel inspection slot on the door. Nothing extra. Nothing friendly. Even the air reeked of rust, slicing at his nose. On the shelf, the standard issue item sat still. A cloudy plastic cup, a coin-sized bar of soap, and a toothbrush. So ordinary it was almost dull. One end bristles to scrub enamel, the other a rigid plastic handle, slim for grip. Marcus glanced at it, at first with the indifference of a man drained of everything that mattered. But after a few more drips of water, the toothbrush crept back into his sight. Some things seemed trivial until they were the only thing left. He lifted his hand, turning it over. Cold plastic, feather light, tiny grooves on the handle for better grip. A harmless object, made to keep a mouth clean and a breath fresh, completely at odds with the tar-like hatred bubbling in his chest. He set it down, picked it up, set it down again. In his mind, Elena Ward's silhouette passed by like a streak of light, not loud, not angry, only a calmness that crushed every frenzy. That calmness had split him apart in the cafeteria. That calmness, with a ring of keys chiming at her hip, still echoed in his ears even within this sealed box. It can't end here. The thought appeared, thin as a hair at first, then thickening into a rope coiling around his scraped wrist. Not for honor that had bled out onto the cafeteria floor, but for a searing need. To prove that he, though buried, still had agency. Just once. Just one moment. He needed to erase the image of himself pinned to the ground like an animal. He needed to reclaim a fragment of the before, even if only in his own eyes. Footsteps paced up and down the corridor, steady as a metronome. Shift change. Inspection. Short voices, words bouncing off the steel door without lingering. Solitary was a desert where all sound was drained. He lay back, staring at the swaying bulb, and in the gaps between its flickers, he saw slices of the past. An interrogation room, a red-lit recorder, Thomas Ward rigid as a board. He had tapped his pen on the table back then, steady as today's dripping, and smiled when the story bent to his will. That smile now returned, but it was no longer his. It rested on Elena's lips, not smiling, but carrying the firmness of someone who knows they are right. Marcus shot upright. He paced a few steps across the tiny room, 3 strides, and he hit the wall. He needed an anchor, a clue, something to clutch to drag himself out of the quicksand of helplessness. His gaze landed again on the toothbrush. This time, he did not see a toiletry. He saw a riddle. He gripped it in his hand, testing. The handle snug, surface rough enough not to slip. The bristled end soft, harmless. The handle simple, rigid, and transformable, if one had enough patience. A thought slid in from the edge of shadow, brushing against his mind. He didn't need to speculate far. He only needed a possibility, however faint. He pressed the brush into his palm. The balance felt right. He shifted grips, trying positions his muscles could memorize without sight. Nothing happened. Only him, the trembling bulb, the rust-stung air, and the endless dripping. Yet in that steady rhythm, something else emerged. The beat of will, the rhythm that had once raised him up the ladder of power, the rhythm now stripped bare, cold, but sharper. Marcus set the toothbrush on the bedframe. Still, he must not think of instructions, methods, or any tidy plan. Those paths would expose him. Here, everything had to remain vague, flowing like a harmless habit. Wash face, brush teeth, sit, stand, breathe. If anything changed, it must change within the silence of motions too small for any eye to notice. He looked at the inspection slot. No one there. Only a patch of black, like a half-closed eye. He drew in a deep breath. The chill of the concrete seeped into his bare soles. The bulb quivered again. And he, wordlessly, clasped his idea as one might shield a tiny flame in the wind. In the hours that followed, he forced himself to sit still. Not out of fear, he was far beyond fear, but to listen to the rhythm of this place. Footsteps, changing shifts, the spacing between inspections, the length of conversations drifting through the slit from the next wing, the moments when the fan roared louder from faulty wiring. Solitary, beneath its mute shell, was still breathing, and he needed to breathe with it, not against it. Darkness thickened. The bulb, exhausted, spread a thin yellow film like fish scales. Marcus leaned back again, hand resting on the toothbrush by reflex. In his mind, Elena walked the corridor, compact silhouette, calm stride, keys clinking gently. No show. No threats. Only order. He realized suddenly, what he hated most about her was that serenity that needed no proof. He had built his power with noise. She held hers with silence. "We'll see," he whispered, unsure to whom, to the bulb, the wall, or himself. "We'll see whose silence lasts longer." A thin draft slid through the door crack, lifting dust motes that sparkled briefly before sinking like falling stars. Marcus closed his eyes. The dripping went on. In his palm, the toothbrush's cold plastic left a faint line. He was not dreaming. He was not asleep. He simply lay there, listening to the cell breathe, guarding the ember of his thought from going out. Here, everything grew by patience. Moss on walls, stains on ceilings, stories outside. And from this night, one more thing began to grow. Slowly, very slowly, but surely, intention. He opened his eyes, stared at the dim source of light. It was not warm, nor beautiful. But for him now, it was enough to mark the border between darkness and the flicker still stirring inside his chest. Between who he had been, who he was, and what he intended to do. Outside, footsteps again echoed in the hall. Shift change. A low voice, a short reply, then silence. Marcus turned, placed the toothbrush neatly back on the shelf, as if it were nothing. He reminded himself to keep everything within the shape of the ordinary. Everything else, the truly important things, would move forward in silence. The night pressed hard against the door, but the light remained, thin as a thread. Marcus closed his eyes, letting his thought rest beneath his lids like a blade still sheathed. No need to rush. Here, rushing was the quickest way to die. And solitary, with its four walls cold as a frozen lake, listened to his wordless stillness. Only the steady dripping remained, like a clock without hands, counting the first seconds of another story, a story born from a harmless object, nurtured in silence, and waiting for its single moment. Solitary confinement, after a few days, became a magnifying mirror. It did not only trap breath, but also reflected every dark corner within a man. Marcus Kane knew this well. Every time he lifted his head toward the water stains on the ceiling, old memories rushed back, like a film reel playing on loop, never ending. Once, he was a man who walked in the light. The flashes of reporters' cameras burst across his gleaming badge. Applause in the boardroom, nods of fearful respect. He once thought, this is immortality. But now, all of it had splintered into fragments, echoing back against the narrow walls. Denny and Elena Ward, the child who had once screamed in darkness years ago, was the one forcing him to stare into that shattered mirror. Marcus clenched his teeth. Humiliation, fury, they never left him for a second. And strangely, they did not choke him. They fed him, as if every scratch upon his pride bled into a new kind of fuel. I am not dead. I cannot die like this. At night, when the bulb flickered, he spoke to himself. His voice was hoarse, sometimes no more than a dry whisper. They think you've collapsed, Marcus. No, they just haven't seen my last move. In those moments, he imagined Elena standing right before him. She did not speak, only stared with eyes cold as steel. And he, somehow, would make those eyes tremble for the first time. Not with words, not with the hollow arrogance that had collapsed in the cafeteria, but with an act, short, sharp, unexpected. Each morning, the guard opened the slot, pushing in the meal along with the familiar toothbrush. Marcus kept it carefully, not because he cared anymore about keeping his teeth white, but because he had seen another shape in it, one end soft, useless for his intent, but the other, the rigid plastic handle, could change. If ground the right way, it could become something no one expected. A harmless object turned into a point. He began to study the walls. The chipped plaster corners, the gritty cement floor, the jutting edge of the iron bed. All were tools. He could not let anyone see what he was doing. Everything had to be slow, hidden under the cover of habit. He would brush his teeth as usual, rinse the toothbrush under the faucet. Then, when no one paid attention, he would slide the plastic end against the floor. One stroke, two strokes, a faint screech, like fingernails across glass. Too small for the guards to notice. But in time, as Marcus began measuring time by the footsteps in the corridor. Every 3 hours, a shift change. Every 15 minutes, A cough echoed back. He grew used to the rhythm, learning when he could grind, when he had to stop. He was patient like a sculptor. Each scratch on the plastic was another line carved into the haunting statue he was building in his mind. The statue had no face, only the cold eyes of Elena Ward. And he swore, once, just once, he would make those eyes change. In darkness, thick as concrete, the first flame flared. Not the flame of hope, but of hatred. Small enough to hide behind repeated motions, yet stubborn enough to burn until the day his chance came. On the fourth night in solitary, Marcus sat with his back against the wall, toothbrush in hand. The plastic tip was sharper now, sharp enough to draw a thin red line into his skin. He looked at the blood and smiled faintly. Elena Ward, you think I'm only a shadow, but you'll see. Right here, in the place you believe is the fortress of law, this very place will give me my chance. And I will not waste it. Outside, the wind whistled through the crack in the door, like a warning. But he did not listen. In his mind, there was only one rhythm. The screech of plastic scraping cement, the pounding of his heart, and the image of a hand rising in the final moment. After swallowing his humiliation and feeding his vow, Marcus Kane began to see solitary confinement with different eyes. It was no longer an empty room burying him alive. It became a map. Every crack, every stain, every sound was a coordinate in his plan. He discovered a spot on the concrete floor, right near the bed frame, rougher than the others. When he dragged the toothbrush handle across it, he heard a distinctive screech, sharp and solid. He pretended to rinse the toothbrush whenever there was an inspection, but in truth, the plastic handle was slowly being ground into shape. The weak yellow bulb cast just enough light to reveal the tiny scratches. Each mark, however faint, made his heart beat faster. No one else knew, but to him, they weren't just scratches. They were proof of his will. Marcus knew he had to disguise it. By day, he still followed the routine. Eat, sleep, brush his teeth. He even made sure the guards saw him brushing longer than usual, as if obsessing over hygiene. No one suspected a thing. To them, Marcus Kane was nothing more than an arrogant man, broken and humiliated, now gnawing on defeat in the shadows. In reality, every time he lifted the toothbrush to his mouth, he remembered Elena's eyes, that cold, furious glare slicing across his memory like a blade. And when he rinsed the toothbrush under the faucet, the hard plastic end pressed lightly against the metal edge, leaving another thin scratch. Day after day, the scratches accumulated, and with them, his hatred was sharpened. Marcus began to hear more clearly the breath of the prison. The guard's footsteps always rang out at fixed intervals. Every spin of a lock, every clink of keys in the corridor was etched into his memory. At first, it was instinct. But soon, he turned it into a clock in his head. Exactly 10 minutes after the turning of the lock, a shadow would pass by. After the clatter of the dinner tray, there would be nearly an hour of silence. He used every stretch of quiet to continue grinding. When the bulb flickered, casting broken strips of light on the wall, he would grip the toothbrush and press it firmly against the surface. The screech blended with the familiar dripping. Sometimes he even closed his eyes to imagine. Each scrape was another step toward standing before Elena Ward once again. After nearly a week, the toothbrush had changed. The handle was no longer round and smooth, but tapered into a point. That point was still rough, but sharp enough to carve a red line into his palm. Marcus watched the bead of blood form and smiled. This blood, to him, was not pain. It was confirmation. The weapon had begun to live. A harmless object, now transformed into a claw. And he was its creator. He hid the toothbrush beneath the torn mattress, where the springs bulged out. No one would search there thoroughly. Whenever footsteps approached, he simply lay back, feigning exhaustion. When the guards moved on, he pulled it out again, continued grinding, continued pushing the plan forward. At night, lying alone, he envisioned every detail, his hand clutching the weapon. Elena's face when she faced him, her eyes finally changing, trembling, startled, in pain. That thought looped again and again, becoming both dream and nightmare. Sometimes he jolted awake, sweat soaking his collar, yet his lips whispered, "Soon, soon." For Marcus Kane, solitary confinement was no longer the end. It was a forge, and the toothbrush, a small, ordinary thing, was becoming his blade. Solitary confinement, after a few days, became a magnifying mirror. It did not only trap breath, but also reflected every dark corner within a man. Marcus Kane knew this well. Every time he lifted his head toward the water stains on the ceiling, old memories rushed back, like a film reel playing on loop, never ending. Once, he was a man who walked in the light. The flashes of reporters' cameras burst across his gleaming badge. Applause in the boardroom, nods of fearful respect. He once thought, this is immortality. But now, all of it had splintered into fragments, echoing back against the narrow walls. And Elena Ward, the child who had once screamed in darkness years ago, was the one forcing him to stare into that shattered mirror. Marcus clenched his teeth. Humiliation, fury, they never left him for a second. And strangely, they did not choke him. They fed him, as if every scratch upon his pride bled into a new kind of fuel. I am not dead. I cannot die like this. At night, when the bulb flickered, he spoke to himself. His voice was hoarse, sometimes no more than a dry whisper. They think you've collapsed, Marcus. No, they just haven't seen my last move. In those moments, he imagined Elena standing right before him. She did not speak, only stared with eyes cold as steel. And he, somehow, would make those eyes tremble for the first time. Not with words. Not with the hollow arrogance that had collapsed in the cafeteria. But with an act, short, sharp, unexpected. Each morning, the guard opened the slot, pushing in the meal along with the familiar toothbrush. Marcus kept it carefully. Not because he cared any more about keeping his teeth white, but because he had seen another shape in it. One end soft, useless for his intent, but the other, the rigid plastic handle, could change. If ground the right way, it could become something no one expected. A harmless object turned into a point. He began to study the walls, the chipped plaster corners, the gritty cement floor, the jutting edge of the iron bed. All were tools. He could not let anyone see what he was doing. Everything had to be slow, hidden under the cover of habit. He would brush his teeth as usual, rinse the toothbrush under the faucet. Then, when no one paid attention, he would slide the plastic end against the floor. One stroke, two strokes, a faint screech like fingernails across glass, too small for the guards to notice. But in time, Marcus began measuring time by the footsteps in the corridor. Every 3 hours, a shift change. Every 15 minutes, a cough echoed back. He grew used to the rhythm, learning when he could grind, when he had to stop. He was patient like a sculptor. Each scratch on the plastic was another line carved into the haunting statue he was building in his mind. The statue had no face, only the cold eyes of Elena Ward. And he swore, once, just once, he would make those eyes change. In darkness, thick as concrete, the first flame flared. Not the flame of hope, but of hatred. Small enough to hide behind repeated motions, yet stubborn enough to burn until the day his chance came. On the fourth night in solitary, Marcus sat with his back against the wall, toothbrush in hand. The plastic tip was sharper now, sharp enough to draw a thin red line into his skin. He looked at the blood and smiled faintly. Elena Ward, you think I'm only a shadow, but you'll see. Right here, in the place you believe is the fortress of law, this very place will give me my chance. And I will not waste it. Outside, the wind whistled through the crack in the door, like a warning. But he did not listen. In his mind, there was only one rhythm. The screech of plastic scraping cement, the pounding of his heart, and the image of a hand rising in the final moment. In solitary, Marcus Kane learned to love a sound. Plastic scraping against concrete. It was dry, harsh, sometimes screeching like fingernails across a chalkboard. At first, the sound made his skin crawl. But slowly, it became a rhythm of survival. Each screech was a reminder that he still had the power to change his fate. Day after day, he held the toothbrush in his hand, grinding bit by bit. No one saw, no one heard. Only he and the wall bore witness. Sometimes the plastic grew warm from the friction, leaving behind a faint burnt smell. Marcus opened his palm, savoring that small trace of heat, as if he were holding a secret spark. After more than 10 days, the toothbrush no longer looked as it once had. The once rounded end of the handle had been worn into a point, sharp like the tip of a pen. It wasn't sharp enough to kill outright, but it was sharp enough to wound. For Marcus, that was all he needed. A chance, a moment, one clean strike. He often hid the toothbrush under the mattress, near the jutting spring. Each time he pulled it out, he ran his thumb along the sharpened tip, feeling the change beneath his skin. It was his creation, a weapon forged out of despair. Solitary confinement was meant to break a man's spirit. But for Marcus, it became an ally. No conversations, no noise. Only him and the patient work of sharpening. The endless drag of time turned into his advantage. He began to measure the weapon's progress against his own body, testing it against the skin of his hand, pressing it into his thigh. Each red mark was another step closer to the moment of revenge. Many nights, as the light flickered, Marcus heard Elena's laughter echoing somewhere in his head. Not actual laughter. Elena had never needed that. Only the calm eyes he remembered from the cafeteria. Those eyes followed him into sleep, then returned in his dreams, standing before the bars, silently watching him thrash. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his fist clutching the toothbrush. "I'll make you bow," he rasped, voice hoarse. Just once. Elena Ward. Sometimes, guards suddenly opened the door to check. Marcus instantly slid the toothbrush under the pillow, feigning exhaustion. He knew one slip and the weapon would be confiscated, leaving him with nothing but empty hands. But that danger didn't frighten him. On the contrary, it thrilled him. Each time he got away with it, he felt as if he had won a match. And each small victory fed the larger obsession. The day he would face Elena would come. Gradually, Marcus began to call the toothbrush him, no longer it. He whispered to it like a companion. "You and I, we'll prove it." They'll never see it coming. In the darkness, the crude weapon seemed to have a soul. It was no longer cheap plastic issued to inmates. It was a hidden claw, the blade of his hatred. In the early days of solitary, Marcus had been nothing but a man humiliated. But now, something else glimmered in his eyes. Obsessive patience. He ate less, slept less, yet his gaze grew sharper, his breathing steadier. He was like a predator lying in wait, ready to strike. He no longer spoke much. He simply kept silent, grinding the plastic bit by bit, pouring his will into every motion. Elena Ward, out there, might believe he had been crushed. But in the darkness of solitary, another Marcus was forming, more dangerous, more unhinged, and ready to explode. While Marcus Kane locked himself in the darkness of solitary, the prison began to buzz. Inmates whispered, "He's broken." After the cafeteria, Kane's got nothing left. That Ward girl killed his spirit. Elena heard the rumors but didn't care. To her, Marcus was just one of hundreds of names to watch. The work went on as usual. Head counts, locks opening, patrols. But the truth no one suspected, Marcus had not broken at all. In the dark, he was quietly nurturing a plan. The toothbrush was no longer a standard issue item. It had become a small blade, the plastic end sharpened, glinting faintly under the yellow light. Marcus lifted it in his hand, like a hunter testing an arrow before the hunt. He whispered, "Just one moment. Just once." His grip tightened, the sharpened plastic digging into his skin, painful, but sweet. That sting reminded him the weapon was ready, and that he still had the power to choose his fate. Marcus began constructing the scene in his mind, detail by detail. He pictured Elena on patrol, the keys clinking at her side. He saw himself stepping out of line, suddenly closing in. He imagined the flicker of surprise in her eyes, the tremor as the sharpened point drove forward. Each night, he rehearsed it in his mind, like a script that had to be memorized. Every move, every breath, every swing of his hand. To him, that moment would redeem all the humiliation he had swallowed before the crowd. By day, Marcus wore a mask of calm. He ate, slept, accepted supplies like a man who had surrendered. His eyes downcast, shoulders slumped, steps weary. Guards looked at him and nodded quietly. He's broken. But when the steel door closed, the mask fell away. He pulled out the toothbrush, held it beneath the weak yellow light, and whispered, "They don't know. Elena doesn't know." Marcus no longer thought about freedom, no longer thought about escape. Everything had narrowed to a single point. Elena Ward. He didn't need to kill her to survive. He only needed the moment she trembled, the moment she realized he could still make her hurt. In the warped world he built, that alone was victory. On the 14th night, Marcus sat on the bed, toothbrush in hand. The yellow light fell across him, his shadow stretched long on the wall. Outside, the corridor was utterly silent. No footsteps, no voices, only stillness, heavy as a blanket smothering the cell. Marcus closed his eyes, inhaled, exhaled. In his head, he heard Elena's footsteps, the jingle of keys, and then the short, sharp scream, swallowed by the four walls. He opened his eyes, the familiar crooked smile returning. The smile of a man who once believed he was the law. But this time, it was more twisted, laced with hatred and a quiet madness. The steel door of solitary burst open with a resounding bang, as if the entire prison exhaled after days of holding its breath. Marcus Kane stepped out, eyes narrowing against the dim yellow glow spilling down the corridor. He had been in darkness too long, but this light didn't weaken him. It only stoked the obsession burning inside. His shoulders slumped, his back bent as though broken. Prisoners along the row glanced over, believing Kane had lost all strength, but none of them saw the hand tensed beneath his sleeve. Fingers clenched around the sharpened toothbrush he had been grinding for weeks. Veins bulged, his heartbeat thundered. Each step echoed with the clatter of chains. To the guards, it was nothing unusual. But in Marcus's mind, every rattle was a drumbeat urging him on. Now! Just once. Just one strike. At the end of the corridor, Elena Ward stood waiting. She was motionless, her stance steady beneath the pallid light. The ring of keys at her side jingled softly with her breath. Her cold eyes swept the corridor, taking in each step of the escort. The entire row of inmates fell silent. They pressed their faces against the bars, holding their breath. No one wanted to miss the moment Marcus Kane emerged after his long disappearance in solitary. When the guard finished reading the report, the heavy air seemed to pause. That was when Marcus moved. He bent his knees slightly, feigning exhaustion, then suddenly twisted. His wrist snapped free of the hold, the sharpened toothbrush slipping from his sleeve. In a single breath, he lunged at Elena from behind, arm raised high, eyes blazing with the madness of a man ready to risk everything. Chains snapped taut, metal crashing together in a clamor that thundered through the corridor. The inmates gaped, hearts pounding in time with Marcus's charge. Elena hadn't turned her head, but her body had already reacted. A rush of air hissed past the back of her neck. Her instincts flared. The years of being an orphan, growing up in scorn and danger, had honed a different sense, the ability to feel a threat before it touched her skin. In an instant, she spun. The movement was sharp, clean, drilled 1,000 times. Her hand clamped Marcus's wrist just as the plastic tip hovered inches from her shoulder. A sharp crack echoed. With one fierce twist, she forced his arm back, the toothbrush flying from his grip, its sharpened edge flashing under the light. Without pause, Elena drove his arm outward, pinning it behind his back. Marcus growled, straining with all his strength, but she stepped in, her knee slamming hard into his gut. A dull thud rang out. Marcus doubled over, breath punched from his lungs, his mouth open in silent agony. The toothbrush spun in the air and clattered onto the floor with a piercing clang. The sharpened tip glimmered for a moment, a silent confession of his despair. Elena pressed him into the wall, his face grinding against the cold concrete. Blood surged to his skin, flushing it red. Through clenched teeth, he hissed broken words. "Yeah, you, bitch, I'll..." Elena's voice was low, steady, yet as sharp as steel scraping steel. "You'll do nothing. Not now. Not ever." The corridor froze. Even the fiercest inmates stood rigid, eyes wide. They had just witnessed it. Marcus Kane, the man who once was the law, brought down not by blind violence, but by absolute composure. Guards rushed in, tightening the shackles, forcing him to bend low. Elena released his arm, stepping back half a pace, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't need another word. Her actions were the verdict. Marcus sagged, breath ragged and broken. His bloodshot eyes lifted to Elena, trembling as if to scream. But there was no power left, no threat. Only panic, crushed beneath the truth laid bare. Every move he made had been seen through long before he struck. The sound of the toothbrush hitting the ground still rang in his head. A weapon he had sharpened through countless nights, a revenge he had clung to, shattered in seconds by the gaze and resolve of a prison officer who had grown up out of darkness herself. The metallic clang of the sharpened toothbrush striking the concrete still echoed through the corridor, like a death knell sealing Marcus Kane's last illusion. Every prisoner fixed their eyes on the small object, but no one dared mock. No whistles, no cheap laughter. Only silence, thick, suffocating, heavier than the steel walls around them. In that silence, everyone understood. The man who once thought himself untouchable had just been crushed. Not by law, not by words written on a sentence, but by the composure and cold eyes of Elena Ward. Elena stood tall, her breathing steady, her eyes still locked on Marcus. She didn't need to speak. The twist of her body, the wrist lock, the driving knee, those had spoken the verdict. To the men in these cells, true power was not in shouting or weapons, but in the ability to silence an entire corridor by presence alone. Marcus was pinned by the guards, bent over, breath ragged like an animal caught in a trap. Sweat drenched his temple. his bloodshot eyes lifting one last time to meet Elena's. But in those eyes there was no longer the arrogance that once made a city tremble. No power, no confidence, only terror and the bitter recognition. Every move he made had been seen through before it even began. Two guards dragged him away, chains clattering, the harsh metallic rhythm like a dirge. He no longer resisted. His feet dragged, his shoulders collapsed, resembling more a shadow than a man. The sharpened toothbrush remained on the floor, dimly lit under the yellow bulb. A weapon he had poured his patience into, sharpening day after day in solitary darkness, now nothing more than evidence of his foolish desperation. No longer the blade of hatred, but a symbol of failure. Prisoners along the row turned their faces away. Not out of fear, but because Marcus Kane had lost the last thing that gave him existence. Attention. In prison, to not be looked at was to no longer exist. And in that moment, Marcus became nothing. Elena did not pick up the toothbrush. She merely glanced at it with calm detachment, then turned away. Her footsteps rang evenly on the concrete, each beat like a drum carving a message. Justice does not shout. Justice does not rush. Justice waits. And when it comes, it brings down the proudest of men. In the darkness of the corridor, whispers began to spread. He struck, but she stopped him. With just one look, he lost. Justice has a face, and it stands among us. Elena walked on, never looking back. She needed no glory, no cheers. What she left behind was silence. And that silence was the final sentence, heavier than any words. Marcus disappeared around the corner, dragged back into solitary. The steel door slammed behind him, the bang resounding like a gavel. But no gavel was needed. The verdict had been delivered the moment the toothbrush hit the ground. Within the warped world of gray walls, the story would spread cell to cell, whisper to whisper. A story needing no embellishment, for it was strong enough to endure. Marcus Kane, the man who once abused power, was destroyed by the silence of Elena Ward.